So please remain seated at the end. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas out there, isn't it? So that's NPA is like Christmas. It's a nice gift every year to those of us who work in postdoc advising. Someone said yesterday that NPA is a very gracious organization, and I want to follow up on that and thank the meetings committee for arranging an agenda that has such a nice logical flow to it. I don't think this was intended, but much of what you're going to hear during this plenary dovetails nicely from what we heard yesterday, and that is the main take-home message is postdocs need to be versatile, and we need to help them realize this versatility and build the skills to get there. So we have a nice plenary panel lined up for you to address one of the hallmark resources of the NPA, and that is our core competencies. In enhancing the postdoctoral experience, our quest to develop postdoctoral skills, the NPA developed these 6 core competencies to serve as a guidepost for postdoctoral training and ensure their smooth transition into the next phase of their careers, wherever that may lead them. So during this plenary, we will hear from 3 leaders who have demonstrated a passion for developing postdocs and helping them get to the next level in academia, in the nonprofit and industrial private sector, and then in the government sector. Our first speaker will be Nancy Schwartz, who, as you know from yesterday, is our Distinguished Service Award winner this year. Nancy was integral to drafting the NPA core competencies. She is currently the Dean for Postdoctoral Affairs and co-director of the Office of Graduate Affairs at the University of Chicago Division of Biological Sciences. She served in this capacity for more than 25 years, and in addition to serving on several NIH study sections, foundation review boards, editorial boards, the AAMC Great Steering Committee, and chair of both graduate deans and postdoctoral leader groups, and she was a founding advisory board member of the NPA. Nancy will address the core competencies in the context of what they mean in transitioning to an academic career. Next, we'll hear from Lauren Celano, who is the co-founder and CEO of Propel Careers, which is a life science search and career development firm focused on connecting talented individuals with entrepreneurial innovative life science companies. Lauren is very passionate about working with individuals with strong scientific backgrounds to find exciting growth opportunities in the life science industry. Before Propel, she spent about 10 years in the life science industry working with companies to advance drug molecules, she is on the board of the Mass BioEd, which is an advisory board for the Boston University School of Public Health Pharmaceuticals program. Lauren will talk to us about what the core competencies mean in transitioning to careers in the private and nonprofit sectors. Our last speaker is Joseph Lazio, who is the chief scientist of the Interplanetary Network Directorate at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL. Joseph received his doctoral degree from Cornell University and was a U.S. Naval Research Council Research Associate at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. He served as the project scientist for the deputy director of the Lunar University Network for Astrophysics Research, which is part of the NASA Lunar Science Institute, and was the deputy principal investigator for the proposed Dark Ages Radio Explorer, or DARE. Joseph is going to dare us to think about how to apply the core competencies in preparing postdocs for careers in the government sector. So without further ado, I'll ask Nancy to come up and kick things off for us.
Okay, good morning, everyone, again. I've been asked to start off our morning plenary with a little history of the core competencies. And this organization realized about 10 years ago that postdocs were going into a diversity of careers beyond academics, and therefore wanted to define the skills that were needed that would make them reasonably successful in any career. And that's what the core competencies are. They're a set of skills that you should have in order to manage your career. So we put together a committee that was composed of people from the board of directors and from the advisory board, and labored for over a year or so, and came up with these. And so these have been around for 10 years, and they've actually been used as the basis for several other kinds of tools and resources that have been developed. For instance, the AAMC Great Compact for graduate students and for postdocs are sort of based on the premise of the core competencies. And they are mentioned in any studies that come out of what is going on, and always mentioned as good tools and resources that should be used. So I urge you all to keep these around and think about them. Second thing is that your career skill building starts in graduate school. That's when you first start acquiring the tools that you need for developing your career. So that means two things. One, you should start really thinking about your career that early. I mean, don't wait till 5th year of your postdoc and then say, what am I going to do now? That's just not going to work. And if you do that and then use the postdoc to build, expand, refine those skills, you'll be in pretty good shape. The second thing it means is that because institutions grant the PhDs and not all these other employment sectors, you can't get a PhD from Novartis, you can't get one from NIH, you only get them from the academic institutions. Then that means that the academic institutions should be providing the skills and training in the areas that you need to be successful in areas other than academics. And this is something that some institutions are doing a marvelous job at, and others are sort of lagging behind, but it is something that we are advocating for, that it really is the responsibility of the institutions you're getting your degrees from to give you a broad swathe of information to help your career move forward and to start you thinking about what you're going to be doing. Now, starting on the topic that I was going to talk about, careers in academics, just like there's a great variety of potential careers that you can do, if you're interested in what we call the academics, there's also a very broad set of kinds of jobs that you can have. And so you've got to narrow that down too. You're mostly all getting your degrees from what we call R1, Research 1 institutions, because those are the ones that usually have the graduate programs. Even within those, there are differences between whether you get a faculty position in a basic science department versus a faculty position in a clinical department. And the AAMC data, which tracks this, indicates that there are actually more basic scientists in clinical departments these days than there are in basic science departments. The criteria for those jobs, the hiring process, there are differences between them. And so depending on what you want to do, it's something that you have to be aware of. And then you can go into those that are less research intensive, into those that are more teaching intensive, like liberal arts colleges, community college teaching, all of these kinds of things. And so you have to really be aware of, okay, I want to stay in academics, I want to do some kind of research maybe, and interact with trainees, but even there you have to really think about what you're targeting your goals for. So I've been on many recruitment and selection committees over the years, and mostly now it's for chairs and section chiefs and so on. So I canvassed some of the chairs of the departments at my institution who currently have openings in biochemistry, biophysics, cell molecular biology, and neuroscience. And I asked them, give me the top 3 things that you look for when you're considering a new faculty appointment in an area. And I distilled them down, especially for those that were kind of common. And these are the things that came out. Probably nothing here is unexpected. Obviously, they're looking for people who are doing really contemporary science. And this is obviously demonstrated by your productivity, by the papers that you're publishing, and so on. Has to be in an area that is a growth area, that really has a future. Has to have impact. That's a word that has crept into a review of everything these days. All your grants, when you are writing them, one of the criteria for evaluation is what impact does it have? What importance is it? Obviously, in having research that is contemporary, has a strong future, and has broad impact, that requires you to have some taste in picking the problems that you choose to study. And what they really mean here is that it doesn't come through that this was the idea of the principal investigator whose lab you worked in, but that at least partly along here, this had your input into deciding the direction of the work. And that shows that you have good taste. This will come out not only in what you say and what you write, but this will also go out in the letters that people write about you. And they give you credit for having the ideas. They like to see flexibility to evolve, that what you do for your postdoc is somehow a little bit different than what you did for your graduate work. I mean, the postdoc is supposed to be the last time you get to really have fun in research and do what you want without having to get the money for it. So you should really use it as an opportunity to expand your repertoire, whether it's technical skills or moving in a new direction or applying a technique that you have to a different field. That's really the kind of things that they are looking for, and that you're still successful, obviously, when you do it, so that you've got a set of publications in both realms. So all of those kind of focus on you as a scientist, and then they're really looking for people that are going to fit in, that are going to be part of their community, that are going to be collegial, collaborative, interested in what else is going on. This is one of the big distinctions, I think, between being a basic scientist in a clinical department versus a basic scientist in a basic science department. The basic scientists in basic science departments are a little bit still the old-fashioned silo type thing, that you're your own PI, you got your own grants, and you do your own, set up your own group and do things. And you definitely interact and collaborate. When you're looking at these appointments in clinical departments, which sometimes are actually pay better and are very nice jobs, they're looking for you to really join sort of a research operation. because it's in our clinical departments where we have centers and institutes, which have big multi-PI funding sources like P50s, P30s, U54s, and they're looking for a group of people that are all working in some area. You know, cardiology, from very basic research to translational research. And so this ability to be very collaborative is extremely important in those kinds of jobs. How this is demonstrated, one of the ways would be co-authorship on papers. Beyond what you were doing specifically in your own lab for your own kind of projects. This demonstrates that you are collaborative and so on, and that you will have the ability when you set up your own group to attract people to do this. And then all of these qualities, you have to have the ability to convincingly communicate that you do have all of these skills, that you have ideas, you can execute the work, you can analyze the data, you can write it up from what you put in your first letter of intent, through the research talk that you give, the chalk talk that you give, all the individual interviews that you have, all of this has to come through, okay? Now, I will just briefly now go through the different core competencies and see how they match up to this set of requirements for what departments might be looking for new faculty hires, okay? So obviously, this is just the whole set of them. The first one is your science. You have to know your stuff. You have to know the literature in your field. You have to know everything about it. You have to know the scientific method, know how to do research, and how to communicate that, or you won't have anything. The whole skill development set of the technology, the methodology, you have to be an expert in these kind of things. Lab management here kind of means that you can strategize in how to use your time best to accomplish the most that you can. Obviously, certain kinds of research take a longer-term investment. If you're trying to make a mouse model, it's going to take 6 months. Other things, you do assays in a half a day. So this, you should have a strategy for how you're going to maximally use your time to accomplish all of the goals that you have. In my lab, students and postdocs usually are handling at least 3 projects at a time, because that way the ones that are sort of the long-term things that have a big time investment in them and there's no payoff for a while, they don't get bored or strung out, and they have things to do that are more immediate too. So that's the kind of thing when you have to be doing that, and that will carry through when you're on your own and doing your own thing too. Communication skills is, again, extremely important. The currency of an academician is manuscripts and grants. You will be writing manuscripts and grants the rest of your life if you're in academics. So you may as well learn how to do it and get as good as you can at it, whatever that's going to take, because there's no way you can get away from it if you're going to be doing, or have research kind of thing. Your teaching, speaking skills, things like that as well. Interpersonal skills, these are also very important. And how you get along with people, how you interact. I mean, you probably all know people who talk a good story, and some people like that get a little further in life than people who have a little more difficulty in interacting and those kind of, have weaker interpersonal skills. So those are the kinds of things as well that come under communication skills. Professionalism, we put this in, and it's important, obviously, in the workplace, how you get along with everybody and so on, and then when you get out and start building your own team. In the institution, how you get along with people in your department, with your deans, your chairs, all of this kind of stuff. It's going to be critically important to what you do. And you can start working on these skills as a student and as a postdoc. Disciplinary, you get out there and you are a representative not only of your institution, but you're representative as a scientist of your area that you're in. And you should really be collaborating and working with professional societies, and you'll be working on review boards for grants and things like that. And then society, again, we are representatives of the science community, and since the majority of our funding comes from taxpayers, you have to be able at some point to interact with people that are non-scientists as well. Now, leadership management skills, these are probably going to be emphasized very much in the kinds of careers that Lauren and Joe are going to talk about, but are also extremely important for academic careers. Knowing how to work together with people, learning how to motivate people. I always urge students and postdocs, if you have the opportunity to take on a summer student that you mentor, a beginning graduate student, learn right then at the beginning how you can work with people and get them to do things, to motivate them, people with different learning styles, different communications ability, and so on. And because this is something that obviously when you build your own lab, you're going to have to know how to do, and you can't wait until you're in that position to try to figure it out. Same way with recruiting, hiring, firing, these kinds of things when you build your own lab. Many of our graduate programs allow graduate students to sit on admissions committees, so you start getting a little bit of an idea about, what selection processes are and what are good attributes of people that you would be looking for, things like that. Finances and budgeting. This becomes one of the biggest dilemmas when you start your own lab. You're going to be putting budgets together for your recruitment package, you're going to be putting budgets together for grants, and you go, oh my God, I have no idea how to do this. I'm not an accountant, whatever. Okay, when you're in the lab, take the opportunity to maybe offer to be the person who orders, and you'll get an idea of what things cost. Or just think about it for your own experiments. You do any kind of molecular biology and buy kits. I mean, one experiment can be $600. And you sort of get a concept of the value of the research that you're doing. Even if you're in a lab that, a Howard Hughes lab that's very well funded, you should still be aware of the cost of research. And it's something that you can be learning right at the very beginning. Data management, record keeping, of course. If you're not well organized and you don't have good notes, when you come to write the paper and the grants, you're going to be totally lost. So you better set up systems for doing it, whether it's electronic, paper, and so on. We talked before a little bit about time management and establishing priorities. You establish priorities not only for the research that you're doing, but also for the your goals in life, and this is where you're maybe going to be doing an IDP or something to have a plan for the different things that you need to do, and you map those back to these core competencies periodically. Say, how am I doing in this area? Strategizing and visioning. Again, you read the literature, you compare it with what you're doing, get ideas about where you're going, that kind of thing. One of the things you'll have to do when you have your own operation is learn how to delegate. This was the hardest thing I had to learn, was trusting somebody else to do my research. When I hired my first technician, I actually went back in the lab at night and repeated a lot of the experiments. I simply could not release my work to somebody else and think that it was probably okay. And so it's something that when you especially are so passionate and interested in your own work, that is just really hard for you to kind of let go. But learning how to delegate, that's why I say having a summer student or starting to train a a starting graduate student or something, then you start seeing how you can parse out little pieces and how you need to keep check on people and so on. Diversity, you should learn how to, again, work with a whole range of people with all different kinds of interests and styles and so on. And if you can start doing that during your graduate and postdoc days, you'll be in much better shape when you're starting to set up your own operation or when you go to a new environment where you don't know people and so on. And mentoring, obviously this is something that we talked about that is very important. And if you have the opportunity to not only get the best out of your own mentoring relationship when you're a mentee, and believe me, you can learn as much from a bad mentor, a toxic mentor, because you learn what not to do when you get in that position. It may not be pleasant, but it certainly trains you the kinds of things that a good mentor does. And then when you are in that position, you will have some skill development already. And then the RCR, we all know about this. So how do you develop these skills and demonstrate that you have them? I've sort of gone through some examples of how you can get different ones already. Individually, you have to know periodically what your skills are, think about them, analyze what you have under your belt and what you need to yet acquire. It's really good to do this in the guise of an IDP, and then again map that back to the skills and the competencies. Especially work on skills that you need for applying in the academic market. Publish, collaborate, and another thing that I have noticed over the years, didn't used to be like this, but it is now, that most of the people that we do hire have had a NSF or an F30 when they were graduate students, and when they were postdocs had an F32, a American Heart Association, Damon Runyon, some kind of an independent fellowship. This not only shows that you have the initiative to try to get some funding, that you know how to write a grant, even at that level, and even though it's a mentored experience, you're learning how to write those grants. And it also gives you the opportunity to start developing a little bit of independence while you're in the labs. Because if you've got your own money, you can branch out a little bit and start doing things that are beyond whatever are the lab, core goals. So having these kinds of things are getting to be more important. And these are the kind of people that institutions, especially if you're looking for a predominantly research-oriented career, are looking for. Institutionally, we do have in most of our institutions now places where you can get some training and some exposure to the kinds of things that you need, whether it's in career services, your NPA, NPO puts on workshops and seminars, go to all these things. Many of our institutions now have big infrastructure grants where there's actually great opportunities for different kinds of training. NIH has the best grants, which sort of give you skills for non-academic things, but they do also give you academics. The NRMN is specifically for training people in academics. The ERACTAs give you the opportunity to get real teaching experience. And NSF, the advanced, and the AGAPs are specifically designed to move you into the professoriate. So if you have any of these kinds of things on your campus, to seek them out and find out how you can become a part of them. Extra-institutionally, it's absolutely wonderful now to go to a FACID meeting or to Society for Neuroscience, any of these now. They have usually the first 2 or 3 days of the meeting from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. It's nothing but workshops on career things, how to write grants, and all these kinds of things. People from NIH come and do workshops on K awards and Fs and everything. You should really take advantage when you go to these big meetings. And when you go to professional meetings, sometimes, especially when you're a postdoc, you should also go to the smaller meetings. Gordon conferences, Keystones, FACIBs, those kind of things, that only have about 100 people concentrated in an area. Because whatever you do moving forward, you're going to have people who write letters for you. And having them all come from the same institution, it will look better if you have some people who are not from your institution. And where do you meet those people? You meet them in these small meetings. When you go and present, and then you talk to people that are in this area that you're in, but they're someplace else. And you make connections, start networking, things like that. Get teaching experiments, technology. It's one of the things that you may not get on your own campus, but you may need, and there are loads of courses at MBL and different places, these mini courses where you can learn things. I came from a math, physics, chemistry background. I never had a biology course. And everything I do now is biological. And when I was an assistant professor, I realized that I didn't know anything in genetics. And so I took the 2-week Jackson Lab, John Hopkins course in genetics to get that area that I needed because my work was going in that direction. So be a lifelong learner as well, and don't be afraid to do those kind of things. So I think we'll leave the rest of talking about this for the discussion session, and I'll introduce Lauren now.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I love talking about preparing people for success in a wide variety of career paths. For now, I'm going to focus on industry and nonprofit sectors, trying to give some insights about how the core competencies are being built within the postdoc programs. So first off, there's a lot of options all of you have in industry and nonprofit. I feel like sometimes people bucket it as, I want to go in industry, but there's so much that you can do. Of course, research, but then of course I see a number of people moving into business development and licensing types of opportunities, grant writing and grant administration opportunities, scientific writing, for those of you that like to communicate information. Of course, consulting, and we had a nice workshop earlier today talking about a wide variety of opportunities in that space. Product or project or alliance management, for those of you that like interacting with people and really trying to get people on board to make things happen. Intellectual property, clinical, regulatory, medical affairs. And these aren't even all of the areas you can get involved in, but kind of a large bucket of different places. I also want to stress and reiterate that, in your Ph.D. and in your postdoc, you're building a lot of great skills, right? You have a strong foundation that can then be utilized in a wide variety of paths. But this isn't just about the science. There are a lot of, and we've heard a lot about this, which I'm really pleased about, the transferable skills that you're building within the postdoc that then can be applied to other areas. And I feel like those are what differentiate you from the other people that on paper have the same educational background or the same training experiences. So when I think about moving into industry or nonprofit areas, when I talk with people about their career paths, I always like to stress that the activities you're doing in the academic environment, of course the publications, the presentations, the committees you're involved in, the peer reviewing, the collaborations, it's all valuable experience, and it all can be applied to industry or nonprofit career paths. So I don't want any of you thinking, I'm looking at industry so I can just leave all of that academic work behind. But a lot of you are also probably getting involved in other experiences, like maybe you're writing patents, or maybe you're involved with business activities, or maybe you're involved with writing because you like to communicate information. Maybe you're really strong with software or data analytics because maybe you've got some mathematics or bioinformatics or computational background. Maybe you've taken courses, maybe you've had leadership roles in organizations. There's a lot of opportunity to build these skills in a postdoc that can be applied to other areas. When I think about moving into the non-academic setting, and even in the academic setting, this is important, but teamwork is critically important as you look at industry or nonprofit career areas. And so I wanted to give some ideas of, well, how do you start building teamwork skills? And I'm just going to be curious, by show of hands, how many of you currently are working on collaborative types of projects, either internal or external? Excellent. Almost all of you, which is awesome. And so that's one of the easiest ways to build teamwork skills. You start to learn who you're successful working with, ways to make things happen. A lot of you also, how many of you are working on cross-functional teams with people that are different than your background? Awesome. Excellent. How many of you manage relationships with vendors, getting involved in, say, the ordering process and so forth? What about leadership roles in your postdoc association? Excellent. I figured that would be a given here. And community service. So these are all things you're already doing, but the important thing when you interact with industry and nonprofit, hiring managers and so forth, communicating these things become very important. Leadership is also a quality that organizations really value. They want to find people and hire people that can be leaders, that care about others, that can improve processes, that can become involved in the community. And again, it seems like a lot of you are actively involved in these areas. And so a few ways in terms of developing leadership skills, and there's a lot of overlap, as you'll see when I'm talking about this, leadership roles in, head of the NPA, or if you are head of your grad student association, or if you're head of the, women's group within your university. These are all extremely valuable. Taking leadership roles in collaborations and being the person that spearheads communication, that suggests opportunities for improvement for collaborations. Maybe you get involved in organizing a panel at the Gordon Conference or Keystone meeting, or maybe you get involved in other types of activities. One of my colleagues, when she was a postdoc in Boston, helped organize an event for Chilean scientists. So there's many activities within scientific world and outside of the scientific world where you can get involved in building some of these leadership skills. I also think about things in terms of being proactive. And a lot of you, again, are probably doing this as part of your research activities, managing people. How many of you are involved with managing some sort of people, interns, grad students, other folks? Excellent. Managing a process, relationships with vendors. Maybe you are optimizing processes to make your research better. These are all skills that you're gaining that can be applied to different career opportunities. Communication is the third area that is extremely important as you look at your future career. And this is certainly a differentiator for a lot of organizations when they're looking to hire people. And so a few ways to build communication skills within the postdoc. I mean, certainly all of you give scientific presentations, right? Probably in the last few months, many of you have done this. But how many of you have given talks to non-technical audiences, patient groups, sixth grade classrooms, other things like that, where you're building your ability to communicate with people that don't also have the same level of understanding that you have. Contributing to grant writing opportunities, reviewing colleagues' papers, providing suggestions for them, leading or contributing to the annual report process for grants. How many of you give tours of your lab or your facility or institution? These are all great opportunities to build communication skills. I'm seeing more and more postdocs getting opportunities to, say, write for the institution newsletter or some sort of communications group. Maybe you provide material for a disease foundation because you're passionate about glioblastoma and you can communicate this information to audiences that may want to know about that. Maybe you teach at your institution, community colleges, high schools. Maybe you review or a reviewer for a journal, or maybe you have a personal blog. And so there's many, again, opportunities to build communication skills currently in your postdoc. There's a few other skills that I find also very important as you think about future opportunities. Of course, organizational skills. So how many of you are working on more than one project as part of your work? Excellent. So I'm assuming you're probably developing great time management skills because of that, or hopefully. Many of you may write patents. Again, maybe you're really good at Illustrator and Photoshop because of the microscopy work that you do. These are things that you take for granted, but are really important in the outside world. So thinking about, where do you build skills? So the one wonderful thing about the academic world, one of the wonderful things is, usually within the institutions that you're involved in, there's lots of opportunity to get exposure to other disciplines, other areas, because of the diversity of the institutions that you're involved in. Many may have tech transfer offices, many have communications offices, policy offices, grant administration offices, corporate relations, if you want to get kind of experience of working with partner organizations or outside companies. Many may have a development office for fundraising for the university. Many have research compliance offices, so on and so forth. And so even within your institution, there could be opportunities to gain exposure to career skills that could be applied when you're looking outside. I do a lot of work with Boston University, and so for example, they have now started doing internship opportunities to provide exposure to PhD and postdocs to learn about different areas. They currently have some right now in grants administration and mentoring and scientific writing and scientific communications. And a lot of these are 5 to 10 hour a week opportunities for, say, 3 to 6 months. So that way it's not taking you out of your research in your postdoc, but allowing you opportunities to complement your work. There's also opportunities external to the institutions to gain some experience. And so I'm seeing more and more internships. And when I think about internships external to the institutions, I'm also thinking about the 5 to 10 hour per week, maybe flexible types of schedules. So again, not to interfere with your research, but to provide opportunities to get exposure to writing or business or policy and other activities. But I also think about in terms of maybe you take leadership roles in nonprofits or STEM education initiatives to be able to build the communication, the teamwork, the leadership types of skills. And again, at Boston University, they've been trying to highlight different opportunities that exist within the greater world to provide opportunities for the PhD and postdocs to get exposure to these types of things. And I'm more than happy to talk more about any of this. So why is this all important? And why is skill building important? In the next 3 slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about just for different roles, what organizations look for in individuals that are applying. So when I think about even research-focused jobs, of course, you need to be technical, right? Having your CRISPR-Cas9 knowledge or your bioinformatic knowledge or mouse model development. But fundamentally, it's also really important to think about the other skills, the managing collaborations, the grant writing, the patent work, being able to work cross-functionally. To apply it a little bit further, if any of you are looking at smaller organizations to get involved in, maybe you have a first-time PI, so you're actually setting up the lab, you're getting things going, you're building things. You may want to actually highlight that so they understand that you're comfortable with kind of the emerging area. Maybe you get involved in very innovative directions. I know a number of people when they get into their postdoc lab, they switch directions or they add research focus areas to the lab because their research takes them in a new direction. These, again, are important to highlight. When I think about a few other areas, let's say marketing and communication side, if you are looking at these types of roles, and I'm seeing more and more organizations hiring postdocs for marketing or communications functions, being able to talk about your technical and non-technical writing, your public relations experience, because you're giving seminars about the really interesting research happening within your lab or institution. Maybe you're designing flyers for the Postdoc Association at your university or for other organizations that you're involved in. These are all very beneficial to highlight and to be able to think about how do you build those types of skills. A number of you may be thinking about, say, regulatory types of careers. So, developing processes, training people, improving efficiency, thinking about these types of areas will be helpful for you. And just a few others, and I tried to highlight different areas because I figured for just diversity, it's helpful to get a sense of what people look for. If you want to get involved in, say, policy, and of course a lot of you are in a perfect location, for this, but really building those skills around advocating, developing new initiatives for the trainees, or getting involved, of course, in organizations like this become quite helpful. Maybe some of you are thinking about technical specialist types of roles within organizations. So vendor management becomes helpful, developing budgets become helpful, training people on equipment, and so forth. I want to end this part of the presentation with just having all of you think about, putting a skills development plan in place. What are you looking to build? How can you build that? And becoming very proactive in terms of really making sure that you're setting yourself up for success for whatever career you end up getting involved with. So now I want to turn it over to Joe to talk about more of the government side of things. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I particularly appreciate the organizers arranging for snow during my visit to winter. Okay, well, in any event, you'll see in a moment here, I'm going to be talking about the government national lab perspective. You'll see, although you might not be surprised, Lauren, Nancy, and I, and Tina had a telecon before this and discussed a bit of the details of what we would be presenting. You'll see common themes, even though we did not actually put our talks together jointly or put our talks together in an arranged way. But you'll also notice, and so one of the things I hope you take out of this is I think the government national lab perspective is going to straddle both the academic and the industrial world. But you'll also notice some distinctions. Let me start with one immediately, which is the opinions that I present here are my own. They're based on my experiences at government national labs, but in no way do they represent the official positions of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, California Institute of Technology, NASA, or the Department of Navy. Okay. With that, this part was already read. I got my Ph.D. in astronomy. So the other thing you'll appreciate perhaps about this talk is I'm going to be coming at it more from a physical sciences and engineering perspective rather than, say, the life sciences or biology. I hope parts of it still translate. Spent a postdoc at the Naval Research Lab and then got rolled over to staff. So some part of the presentation is going to be that aspect of what if you're making that transition, or what if you'd like to make that transition, or perhaps are about to make that transition. And then that lofty title there, the short way of saying it is I'm the chief scientist for the NASA's Deep Space Network. And in that role, I actually help manage a part of JPL's internal research portfolio, i.e. dollars. So I can also give a perspective of what are we sort of looking for in the kinds of research or the kind of activities. Okay, you've already seen these core competencies. One of the lessons that I've learned is that I feel really fortunate if people walk out of one of my presentations and remember three things. So I'm only going to talk about three aspects of these. I'm going to assume that you already know one and two. You've got a PhD, you're a specialist in some subfield, some area of expertise. These other things are perhaps more important, well, not more important, but there are important aspects that I think at the moment our graduate school or graduate institutions do a less good job of training us to do. Although you'll see hints of the professionalism sneaking into the responsible code of conduct. One of the other things, though, backing up for a moment, if I can, I think Nancy stressed the versatility aspect. I'm trained as an astronomer, so the picture you see there is me holding what we once upon a time thought might be an antenna that we would put on the moon to do radio astronomy. So I'm trained, my love is really looking up at the sky and looking at extraterrestrial sources. But one of the aspects from a government or national lab is being able to take those skills and transfer them to other problems. So I've worked on things such as an airborne millimeter wave imager looking down. And those are crucial aspects of being able to build that initial set of skills and research experience, but also seeing, hey, it could go in these other directions. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking for in young people. Okay, so communication skills are perhaps more important than I think we often appreciate. That includes things such as writing. Why should you care? And this is an illustration. I think Nancy made a similar point. JPL and actually most of the government labs have some internal pot of money that they can apportion for research projects to perhaps stimulate a project a little bit farther before it can get external funding from someplace like NASA or the Department of Energy or the DoD. So there's some amount of money that has to get apportioned out to people to do various projects. And this is a subset or a snippet from an email that I received, and in fact I really need to get to this email, there's a set of concept papers that are submitted, and you can see there the number submitted this year was for 257. I get to recommend 20 to go forward. So what can you do to make sure that you're one of those 20 that I recommend? And one of the techniques that the military has, and I think is not, well, it's actually counterintuitive to what we're trained as scientists. What the military has is a technique called bluff, bottom line up front, which is exactly opposite for how we typically do academic papers, right? Think about the classic academic paper. There's an introduction, a background, a context. Here's a presentation of research analysis and results, and then your conclusions. But if you're trying to be one of those 20 out of the 257, what you've got to try to do is say in that first paragraph, here's why you care. Here's why I should not skip to the next one because I can't quite figure out what's going on in the rest of this paper. So you've got to think about how are the ways that you can communicate effectively in writing, and I think this is for an internal process. The same thing happens for grants. How do you get the message across very quickly so that when I've got, in another context I served as the reviewer for a telescope. I've got 60 proposals sitting in front of me, and not all of them can get time. So why should your proposal get time on the telescope as opposed to somebody else? The other aspect, and again, both Lauren and Nancy have touched on this, is the speaking aspect. We're going to do a lot of that. That's both from a scientific perspective in conferences, presenting your research results, which we very much like to see in government labs, but also perhaps briefing. You're working on some projects, so you've got to brief some aspect of lab management or other parts of the project of what the status is. Now, this is what we'd all like to believe a typical conference audience looks like, right? Everybody's, and I'm sure actually that's what this one is, everybody's hanging on my every word. But I organized a so-called focus meeting. This is a small meeting, it's a meeting within a meeting at a recent International Astronomical Union. And pay no attention to the fact that they put us in a large room, or a room that was larger than we should have been. What I did, and this is a picture taken at some point, we actually did come close to filling it, I think, at some times. But I went through this picture now and sort of asked, can I figure out who's paying more attention to the laptop than the speaker? Now, some of these people, to be fair, right, some of these people could be diligently taking notes, but based on both what I've seen and I will confess some of my own experience, some of these people are clearly working on email or they're reducing data or, they're just completely not paying attention to the speaker. And also the blue circle is the person who's horribly jet lagged. So your job, certainly from a scientific presentation standpoint, is how do you convey those essential details so that you have the people are paying more attention to you than to their email. And conversely, now, from a project briefing standpoint, that may not be quite as essential because, okay, if you're giving a briefing on a detector for a particular instrument, the person who's, on thermal might not really need to know about it. On the other hand, if you think that the thermal person needs to know about some aspect of the detector, you really want to make sure that you can convey that information. So one of the aspects here, and particularly from the standpoint, if English is not your first language, what more can I say than practice, practice, practice? And if you're talking about your own research, that may be easier, right? I will at least confess to, at times, having to put together the talk without having done a lot of practice. But like all things, practice, stand in front of a mirror, get feedback from your colleagues about speaking presentations and speaking style because it's going to be incredibly important. The other, let's see, before I go on, the other thing, and part of this I will confess is my own pet peeves, but I think if you go out and you read blogs or posts about how to give effective presentations, okay, consider the presentation that looks like this, where you start with the Einstein field equations, you clearly go to the, go to a Schwarzschild or a flat metric, and you immediately end up at the pulsar TOAs. Okay, your objective is to ensure that your key points are communicated to the audience. Do not assume that your audience is an expert in the subject. Provide that background and ensure that everything on your slide is there for a reason and is explained. Now, I intentionally read this to you because the guy for whom I work, if I had done this slide to him, he would have given me about 15 seconds and he said, okay, good, next. So let me back up here. You know, if you're going to present an equation-rich slide, remember that not everybody in the room may be an expert. Even the experts may have forgotten something or, you know, have something else on their minds. So you need to make sure, and this goes for your fancy plot as well, if you've spent a lot of time putting data together on a plot, make sure that you're walking the audience through and reminding them, how do you get from step to step? Or you've got lots of colors on your plot. Why do you have all those colors? What are the axes? Does the audience even understand what the axes are? So you've got to walk people through plots, and that may mean that you cover less material, but your point in giving a presentation is presumably to convey information. Similarly, and I will confess this is partly a pet peeve, but it's also, again, in briefings that I've been in, I've certainly seen people say, yep, good, next, because I can read the slide a lot faster than you can read it to me. So what additional information are you presenting that is worth having the slide up there? In fact, what additional information are you presenting that means it's worth you being up here presenting as opposed to just handing out a packet of slides and let people read it? And finally, from the perspective of listening, I didn't actually see this in the core competencies, but I consider it incredibly important, and particularly in the context of government or national labs. They're very often mission-focused. You know, JPL is an excellent example, right? JPL is focused on primarily putting robotic probes around other planets. Navy labs, you know, Navy labs are focused on some aspect of improving naval technology, making ships safer or something like that. So from the perspective of people who are actually controlling budgets and managing programs, we're trying to get certain things done. Which means if you've got a great hammer, it doesn't matter how great that hammer is if I'm looking for a screwdriver. And I've actually made those kind of presentations where, you know, I've got this great HF antenna, and at the end of the presentation, it's clear, well, the guy to whom I was speaking had a decent HF antenna. He wasn't quite clear he needed a better one. So you need to be able to listen to what it is that the lab needs, what it is that the projects need, and try to figure out, hey, maybe I've got a great hammer. It's a really tough sell if the person thinks he or she really needs a screwdriver. By the same token, if you can say, hey, if you haven't thought about this, and you can convey that information clearly, that can be a big win. Okay, moving on to the leadership and management skills, and I think this might be a bit of a distinction from sort of the more academic environment. This is a hierarchy that have sort of, genericized, made more generic from a typical lab structure. And it's actually, at some level, you could say it's not that much different than an academic environment. You could say, okay, there's a dean of a college, and under the dean of the college, there are various department chairs, and under the department chairs, there are various faculty members. The difference is that the faculty members are typically, they're almost like free agents, right? The department chair, at least from my experience, the department chair doesn't really control the faculty members. Whereas in this case, it is much more of a strict hierarchy. You know, there are group members, there's a group leader or a group supervisor who's reporting to a section manager, and they're worried about, okay, how do my people make sure that they're supporting the various projects, or what if I don't have enough projects to support all my people? If you're a new hire into this kind of structure, there's probably going to be less of an emphasis on the hiring and recruitment aspects than there would be, say, in an academic position. If you're coming into one of these groups, the role of recruitment and retaining personnel, that's typically more the group supervisor and section manager responsibilities. That doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't opportunities to do things, but by and large, you're going to have to learn the experiences of hiring and firing or recruiting and retaining people more from the kinds of things that have already been discussed, such as trying to identify summer students or working with other people to identify summer students. The other aspect I will point out about this, though, is very often the government and national labs have some kind of affiliation with universities. So as a very good example, JPL is actually part of Caltech. It's not part of NASA. So I'm officially a Caltech employee. NASA Goddard, the people at NASA Goddard are NASA employees, but they have a very strong connection to Catholic University. For a long time, the DOE, well, at least some DOE labs were managed by the University of California, and I believe, again, there was sort of a similar relationship that the employees of the labs were actually employees of the University of California. So very often there are ways that you can form partnerships to universities, and those are really good things to exploit. They're often valued, as well as they're another way to identify new talent and perhaps to explore areas or bring in new perspectives and bring in new technology that otherwise the labs might not be working on. But nonetheless, if you come into a structure like this, one of the things you certainly can do is start looking for, are there ways to show leadership or management skills? So that one of those very first slides when I showed you the number of proposals that I have to evaluate, one of the things that the labs often do is they have small pots of money precisely to allow innovative new ideas. So young people can propose, try to figure out what are those avenues, and can you exploit those? Can you start writing those? They're initially small proposals. They won't perhaps cover a lot of your time or things like that. But at the very least, it's an opportunity to show that you're starting to think about how do I write proposals and perhaps pulling in other parts of the lab. Timelines, timescales, budgets, others have already referred to this. I was doing it this morning. And on the one hand, I completely sympathize with the notion that, I really trained to be an astronomer, not an accountant. And yet Nancy made the point about a certain amount of independence that it gives you. It's also another way to demonstrate leadership or management skills in terms of really understanding where the money flows is in some sense an understanding of where power is flowing. And therefore, understanding how to do these budgets, what things cost, who might be needed to do what parts of a project are incredibly valuable. Finally, I couldn't not say anything about this aspect. If you've paid any attention to the news, you know that astronomy has had some high-profile cases recently of misconduct. Let me just ask you the question, which of these data were taken by a man and which were taken by a woman? The one in the upper right is actually changes in brightness of a star, and the argument in the paper is that the structure there, its phase to the orbit of a planet going around there, therefore represents an interaction between a star and a planet. The lower right is the arrival times of radio pulses from a particular kind of star that we call a pulsar when they arrive at a radio telescope over the course of something like 5 to 6 years. And the one on the left, if you've paid any attention to the recent news, those are the recent LIGO data illustrating the direct detection of gravitational waves from two merging black holes. In all cases, these things would have happened whether we were paying attention or not, right? The radio pulses from that pulsar, the lower right, pulsar is, a billion years old or something. It's been doing this for 100 million billion years. It's going to keep doing it for at least another 100 million years or so. So at some level, the universe doesn't care, right? We're doing really tough work, and the point behind one of the points behind all of this is the universe doesn't care. We're doing really tough work, so we need to work together to solve these really tough problems. In fact, you really shouldn't be working on anything other than tough problems, because if it's not a tough problem, it should have already been solved, and you should be doing something else. The other aspect is, in all cases, this was a result of teamwork. The upper right was actually a team that was led by a woman, but the rest were, the number of people who contributed to getting those radio pulses must be in the tens. And the number of people involved in the LIGO work, well, there was a recent paper that came out about the LIGO work that I think had something like 1,500 authors on it. And even in the case of, take a more case such as what JPL, we're trying to get a spacecraft on a launch pad at a certain time. That's also teamwork. Yes, it may be the vision of an individual person or a small number of people, but getting a spacecraft on the launch pad by a certain date, or in terms of getting, actually understanding how to make a laser interferometer that can detect gravitational waves directly, that takes teamworks of sometimes hundreds to thousands of people. So it's really important to understand how to work with people, do it in a fair and equitable manner. Again, the universe doesn't care about what your sex is, what your ethnic background is, and also keep in mind the history of you can't do it alone. It really is a teamwork process, and be able to work with people to get their kind of results out. Okay, I think that's everything, and I'll close with that, and I think it's now a discussion period.
A little over 15 minutes for questions. I'm going to encourage you to use the microphones, but I just want to reiterate much of what we saw here was that communication skills are very important, including writing. So if you're looking for practice at that, I encourage you to contact the Postdoctorate committee. And if you're looking for ways to expand your leadership and teamwork skills, remember NPA is a volunteer organization. We have several committees that will enable you to build those skills.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Marcela Hernandez. I work at The Ohio State University, and I'm one of the NPA's diversity officers. And some of you mentioned this explicitly and some of you more implicitly, but I would argue that the concepts of diversity and inclusion are another core competency that needs to be addressed in every single environment, not just in academia. And I think that companies, as we know, companies are starting to have also diversity officers, and government institutions as well, like national labs and others. So one argument that I keep telling my graduate students and postdocs at my institution is that if they are well-versed on these areas, that's an absolute plus. Because all of these institutions are trying to be more diverse and inclusive, and if they can hire people that are already on that wave, that really helps. And I'd like to know if you would agree with that.
Yes, 100%.
Yes. That was
Any discussion?
Quick answer. Thank you for the comment.
Yeah, I guess I'd go back to do I have to take this off? The notion that the universe doesn't care about, the universe doesn't care what we're doing at some level. What that means is trying to solve these hard problems really needs that diverse viewpoints, or having diverse viewpoints is more likely to get us to a correct solution faster.
I'd just like to follow up with what Dr. Hernandez says. My name is Alberto Roca. I'm one of the original members of the NPA members that came together in 2003. There were about 60 of us postdocs, and we have formed the diversity committee back then, so diversity is still something that I helped do on the advisory board. Diversity language was included in some of the original drafts of the core competencies. Emil Chuck, who's on my board and was one of the early diversity committee members, was involved with writing the document. But it was decided, it was going to be a part of under professionalism, but it was decided not to have that explicit language. But the conversations are definitely there. This is a process in terms of how to put together these documents, but the drafters of the document did at least discuss these ideas of explicitly having diversity inclusion language. And then if I can also do another plug for communication issues, a book just was published, Science Blogging by Yale Press. If you go to my website, minoritypostdoc.org, you'll see the book. I wrote the chapter on using social media and diversity. The book could also be called Science Outreach. It's basically all sorts of advice about how to use online tools for communication and outreach, which could be applicable to other areas besides science. But if you're particularly interested about communication skills, this brought together about 25 authors to try to give you a leg up in getting into this business, because it is really hard. There's a lot of resources out there, and especially online, it's hard to know how to do it. And so I think it's this, as well as other things that the NPA have done, are very complementary in terms of how to put these core competencies into practice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hamed Mirzai. I'm the president of the PDA at University of Southern California. And if you remember, I do a very bad job in asking questions. So here's my question. Science communication is obviously very important, and I would add to your comment that university doesn't care at all, not just in some cases. But how do we as postdocs can convince people that we have to communicate science or raise funds to do that? Like, and this is not a plug, I started a nonprofit foundation specifically for science communication, but getting funding for it is a big issue. So how do you transition from a postdoc to these positions, whether it's in governmental labs or nonprofit, outside academia, or even stay in academia, and raise funding and awareness for that?
I mean, I think funding, well, I mean, raising money is always challenging for anyone, and anyone that can raise funds oftentimes has a job, since people need that as an activity. But I would say networking. It probably goes back to building relationships, sharing your vision, getting people excited by the work that you're doing, and hopefully finding those folks that can either contribute financially or maybe make connections to organizations that could contribute from that perspective. But I would say the networking there is probably extremely helpful.
And a follow-up question. If you are involved in a home-brewed nonprofit that you're doing on the site, how detrimental is that to your looking for a job in any of the positions that you guys talked about? So if I have that line on my CV that this is what I'm doing on my private time, do you look at that as, oh, they're going to invest too much time outside what I'm hiring them for, or is it a good thing?
I think it's awesome. I think it shows a lot of proactivity. It shows you've got a passion for something. If you're still successful in the postdoc and doing this also, it also shows that you have good time management and organizational ability. So I see it as a win-win.
I would add the caution, though, of Lauren said time management, so make sure the balance is appropriate. I certainly am aware of cases in which the key aspect is scientific publications. What's the peer-reviewed or very high-profile conference presentation that you can point to? And so there is an aspect of balance. If you've got a very high-profile Twitter presence, that may be great for getting a position at a planetarium. It may be less so for an R1 research faculty position.
Thank you.
Hi, Rachel Bergerson, University of Minnesota. I was just wondering if I could get a comment from Lauren and Joe about the responsible conduct of research. So I think Nancy had talked a little bit, we kind of know what that is in academia. We have to go to training if we're on NIH funding. But, it still seems like sort of one of those things that a lot of PIs just think, oh, we got to do it. It's not as important. But how much is that emphasized in the non-academic environments? And I'm assuming it's very important, but is there certain training or things that are special considerations for those other areas?
Yeah, there certainly is training or attempts at it. I think I'm sort of trying to remember back to NRL days, but I'm pretty sure there's always and I suspect this is true now across most of the government and national labs, if not all, some kind of, I think, poorly worded sexual harassment training, which I think they really mean anti-harassment training. But yeah, I think there's, as in many cases, some people get it and some people don't. And it can be either group supervisor or group or section specific, or and perhaps the same is true at faculty or at, in university departments of sometimes people get it and sometimes they don't. So yes, there is training. Not always, my sense is not always does it stick.
And I would say for industry, especially for research roles, it's extremely important in terms of conduct of research. And I mean, a number of the large organizations have very in-depth training programs. For some of the smaller companies, they might bring in consultants to train people to make sure that things are done correctly. But it's definitely very, very serious, and people pay a lot of attention to it.
And there are consequences as well, increasingly consequences. And again, I made reference to what's happened recently in astronomy, where high-profile researchers have lost jobs as a result of, essentially not behaving well.
Yeah, I'd say in academics, even though we emphasize RCR a lot, most of it mandated by our funding sources to not only give the training, but give repeated training and so on. It's probably harder in academics to get fired for something like that than it is in your areas.
Hi, I'm Amita. I'm an international officer in NPA. I have a question for Nancy, and this is a very international postdoc focused question. So you mentioned about faculty appointments and preference given to postdocs who have individual fellowships. But if you think about international postdocs, not everybody is probably as fortunate as some of us who may have individual fellowships from Australia, New Zealand, whatnot. How's the international factor factored into the appointment, that it is not that these postdocs are not bright enough, but there are very limited options in the US for these postdocs to apply for fellowships because you have green card, permanent residency requirements, so there are specific eligibility requirements. So are those things considered in when you appoint people in at faculty level?
Well, the nice awards that NIH started were the Kangaroo Awards, the K99 ROs, which are open to international students. And getting one of those almost, really helps in getting a position, because you spend 2 years of it in a mentored, semi-independent postdoc, and then you can take the last 3 years to your new institution where you get a job. So there are some opportunities. And many of the private ones are also open to international students. There are certain ones. Offhand, I don't know for sure, but there are some opportunities too.
So I think what I'm trying to say is, so the majority of US postdoc population is international, and there are paucity of funds that this international population can actually apply for. So when you consider these postdocs, perhaps people who are appointing them or appointing for positions should also bear in mind that it's not that these individuals are not bright enough. It's probably that they did not have options, or there are very limited resources that they could actually apply for. Mm-hmm. So maybe get the balance right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's a mandatory kind of thing, but I think that if you look over recently backgrounds of people who have been hired, that people who have had these kinds of funding mechanisms earlier in their career tend to be ones. And NIH came out with some data a couple of years ago about that the people that get actually the most R01 funding, anybody here from NIH that can tell me if I'm right or not? The people who get R01 funding are people who have had NSF grants in graduate school. And then if you have had an individual F, it's next. If you've been on a T32, it's next. So, because these kinds of things do give you a lot of mentoring, because it's all built into getting the funding as well. So they help you to develop a lot of these extra skills, because it's part of the funding mechanism.
Hi, I'm Melissa Vaught, and as a plug, I am the editor-in-chief of the Postdoc. So if you are looking at getting more of that communications experience, look me up while you're here. So I had a question. One of the things that I really liked about your presentation, Lauren, was that idea about the skills development plan. And I think my prior experience and what I hear a lot of other postdocs talk about is not really knowing what those skills are. Because we tend to talk about them in very broad terms of like, oh, well, communications and leadership and that sort of thing. And so when you start looking through some of the job postings for these careers, especially careers outside of academia, of what people are looking for, how can you kind of back translate that so that you can begin understanding what sorts of skills it is that you need to develop to reach those goals?
Yeah, well, so you bring up a great point in terms of using the job descriptions as a guide. I would go one step further and also use LinkedIn. So, find a title at an organization, search for people that may have that title, see how they actually describe their role, and then that may help the postdocs be able to articulate the things they have that could be relevant for that job. And so even, I think part of it is, well, in talking with a number of people, I feel like many postdocs just assume that people know they do these things because that's what you do if you're a postdoc, like manage collaborations or write grants or communicate to non-technical audiences, et cetera, et cetera. So I think part of it is the awareness building that it's important to be able to communicate what you do in the way that people are used to hearing it. And so using the job descriptions, going, bullet point by bullet point, making sure that you can understand what is being asked for, and then describe your work in that type of setting.
I would, if I can add to that too, don't sell yourself short. I was actually talking with a postdoc recently and trying to get him to think about, okay, there may not be an option for you to continue in your current position at the lab, but are there other places at the lab? And as I was walking through with him, okay, what have you done of the, it's like, well, that seems to apply over here, and that seems to apply over here. So I think this is called imposter syndrome, but there's often a sense among us of, oh, well, I haven't done explicitly what's listed, but think back on the things you have done and say, oh, I've sort of done something, they're looking for an optical engineer. Well, I haven't perhaps done optical engineering, but I've done something with lasers. Okay, so at least you know how to spell laser, and maybe you've set up an optical bench or something like that. That being able to say beyond simply, well, I did this, and this, there is a certain amount of marketing to it, but by the same token, don't sell yourself short.
So I think we'll take one last question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Marta Vučković from UC Berkeley. I was wondering if you can give me your predictions in the next 5 years. I guess we are all being trained to serve to the society in general with our training and kind of analytical thinking. So could you each give me some predictions in the next 5 years? Where do you think the biggest demand for people with scientific training will be, either in the US or even globally, if you can dare to give me some predictions?
Predictions for careers. So I guess I'll start with this. So areas that I see huge growth in, any of you that are analytical, which is probably most of you, you're probably better at analyzing data than the normal population of people. So data science roles, bioinformatic roles, any sorts of roles in that big data type of area. And again, even if you're not a computational biologist, you're probably really good at Excel and R and MATLAB and other things that you just, again, take for granted because that's how you analyze your data. Most people are not that skilled. Intellectual property. There's a huge need for all of this cool technology that's being developed. If you can understand and communicate your information, patent firms are hiring a lot, and then consulting firms, the McKinsey, the BCG, the Deloitte, plus there's a whole range of smaller consulting firms that love hiring PhD and postdoc trained talent to work with them on strategy or operational activities or even technical diligence type of work.
In academics, you may notice in many of your institutions that we're changing the names of many departments. What used to be sort of old-fashioned names are kind of going out, and we're coming up with these very creative new names, like systems biology. Well, that's, you know, a mix of cell biology and genetics and different kinds of things. But things like that, where you're bringing together areas that used to be sort of separate before, and you're able to make those transitions across borders. Anybody who's trained like that is going to be a scientist of the future. And another big area, obviously, mostly because of our major funding elephant in the room of NIH, is that anything that certainly has translational aspects to it, or clinical relevance, or therapeutics, devices, bringing in engineering and those kinds of things. At least that's the way I'm seeing most of our major universities developing big institutes in and things like that.
And I'll first off echo Lauren's comment about big data. I think the president of the American Astronomical Society recently read a column in which she pointed out that I think it was either a financial or some big data firm, and he was asked, and he said, oh, the first people I go to try to hire are astronomers and then physicists, or it was the other way around, physicists and astronomers, because there's this history of being able to break down problems and deal with big data, and I presume this, you know, presumably bioinformatics or genomics somewhere in there as well. I think in broad pictures, my understanding of the data is just that more and more of the positions are outside the traditional academic ones, so you do need to pay attention to the government labs and the industry things. Maybe I'm not supposed to be saying it, but in spirit of honesty, at least in the physical sciences, the world's getting a lot flatter. From the standpoint of a young person, there are incredible international opportunities. Maybe that means you will never come back to the United States, which I think may be a public policy issue for the United States, but certainly in my own field of astronomy, some of the greatest areas of growth are outside the United States, and so you do have the opportunity to at least consider that, particularly while you're young and you can move around a little bit more. Don't forget to think about that or put that in the option space.
Well, looking towards the future was a great way to end this, and that question wasn't a plant, but thank you for asking it. And let's, before we break for lunch, Belinda has some announcements to make, so I want us to, while Belinda comes to the stage, let's thank our speakers one more time.